Hello and welcome to episode 2 of You Just Got Snapped, brought to you by yours truly, Jamie, aka Keldon, aka Shivan Haven. I will try to have the naming mechanism figured out before episode 3. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and jump in because this is going to be a longer episode. I want to spend some time talking about my favorite decks. And so what this kind of entails is, number one, I'll show you what I'm playing today as of the 15th of May, 2024. And I stress that because I hot swap cards, depending on what's going on all the time in this game. But yeah, so we'll talk about my favorite decks. I'm also going to talk about some of my recently built decks. In the sake of Ultron, a recently rebuilt deck, because that was a card that I used quite heavily at one point. Ended up deleting it after a while, just because the meta changed and it didn't make sense. And now that we've had some changes with Ultron over the past week and a half, excuse me, I went ahead and brought it back and built a new deck to base around it, so we'll cover that one today as well. Alright, so like I said, longer episode, so I'm going to go ahead and get into the swing of things. So when you think about building a deck in Marvel Snap, just like any card building game, Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, I know there's tons of them out there, just lightly glossing the surface there, you want to go in with a strategy. So Magic the Gathering, your strategy usually starts with, if you have like a card that you're really excited about and you want to build around, or you're looking at the mana, so maybe I want to have a red-black deck, so all my mountains and my swamps, I want to have a deck based around those lands in particular for Magic. And Pokemon, it's the types of Pokemon, so you could have a water-based deck, for example. So that comes into play for Marvel Snap as well. The way we typically look at things, and I'm going to back off of this, I was showing my favorite deck, which we'll come back to in a moment. You notice how I name some of my decks. Like I said, I have an Ultron-based deck. MDK, which is Murder, Death, Kill. MDK all day. So that one is based on destruction, so that's a deck type, is I want to destroy everything as possible. Zero Decks is a deck type where you're trying to make your opponent's cards go to zero or even negative numbers if possible. When we get back to my She-Not deck, which I'll explain very in-depth here in a moment, that one I just call like a power deck, because my goal is to make a deck that's very powerful, get all my powerful cards out, or have a powerful turn that can turn the tide of a game. So just a few different ways to think about it. And there's a few more, like discard decks, move decks, where your cards are constantly moving around, just to scratch the surface. So we'll kind of break into some of those today. The reason I want to explain that up front is I want you to think of that as you're building your own decks, or if you're recrafting a deck. So from a strategic perspective, I like to try to combine at least two different deck types into my decks that I know I'm going to be playing a lot. So She-Not kind of looks at that strategy from, this is going to be a power deck because it's focused on getting to turn 7 and releasing a lot of power on turn 7. So that's its main focus. And then its secondary focus, I actually have a couple different ones because I kind of have a sprinkling of other items here. Such as like Rogue, where you're stealing your opponent's abilities, and then there's also prevention of being destroyed, because this is a very 1-cost, 6-cost card deck. I have 6 in there, so that's half the deck alone is 1 cost or 6 costs. So having this card here, for example, in there, so I'm protecting this card. So there's a protection element to this deck as well. That's something I think that I would be excited to see more in the future, because there's so many like destruction decks going on. So if Marvel Snap, as time goes on, can put more focus on the protection capability, casting protection across your cards, that would be awesome. But this is by far my favorite card that I have for this deck in particular, because of the fact that half of the deck is either 1-cost or 6-cost cards. So anyway, so that's some of the background logic, and I'll continue to dive into that as we look at some of the other decks that we'll be looking at today as well. But let me go and jump into this one. I kind of gave a spoiler about my main goal for this one. It's to get to turn 7. So how do you get to turn 7 if you're new to the game? Magic comes to mind. So Magic will cast a land change, which is called Limbo, there is a turn 7 to this game. So if you can get magic out early on, it is a 3-cost card. Not very powerful, only 2 power level at its base anyway. Obviously, there's things out there that can manipulate that. So you're really you're sacrificing one of those very important land or card spots for a land to simply change it to a turn 7 game. But in the case of this deck, for a very good reason. The reason why I want to get to turn 7 is if you have the perfect game or close to a perfect game, you're going to be able to drop 30 plus power across at least minimum of 2, possibly even 3 lands if things work out in your favor. So how do I do that? So let's look at our most powerful cards in the deck. So we have Infinite. And so if you're unfamiliar with that, this is a 6 casting cost card, but look at that power level, 20. Yikes. It does come with a very important caveat, and this is why it's kind of middle of the road, people that like to play it versus people that just avoid it because it's complicated unless you can come up with the right deck archetype for it. But if you played a card last turn, you can't play this. So you're sacrificing a turn to drop this card onto the playing field. I have a way around that, though. So let's talk about how to do that. So we have She-Hulk. That's the next card. So yes, I'm sacrificing turn 6 if I can get magic out. But we're going from 20 power on one land to 30 power across, minimum 1 or 2 lands, depending on how things are laying. Because, if you skip turn 6 and you have She-Hulk in your hand, this becomes a 0 casting cost card. And you have a power level of 10, so very insanely awesome there. Red Hulk is in this deck. This is one of those cards that I will swap out occasionally along with Rogue and White Widow, which I'll get to the 2 of those in a moment. So Red Hulk closes out the high-level cards for this. To be honest with you, it's in the deck, but I hardly play it. And the reason why, I mostly have it there as a decoy, really just to mess with my opponent. And so what do I mean by that precisely? Thank you for asking. If you get Red Hulk earlier in the game, it's going to be a dead giveaway to your opponent. Or if your opponent has Red Hulk, it's a dead giveaway because you'll have the game animation that will focus on letting you know that something's being powered up in your opponent's hand. And right now, that's Red Hulk. It's blatantly obvious when that gets more power to it. If you're unfamiliar with Red Hulk, extremely powerful. It's already received a buff because of how powerful it was. It started out, if I remember correctly, as 6 casting calls, 12 power, I believe it was. They dropped it down to 9, but it's still a really good card. Even if you build a deck around Red Hulk, it's a good card. But as you can see, when your opponent ends a turn with unspent energy plus 4 power, if this card is in hand or if it's in play. Wow. So by default, that's a good card on its own, but why do I not play it? Well, it's simply just to trick my opponent. So they're focused on the fact that anytime they have unspent energy, something's being powered up in my hand, and pretty much everyone knows it's Red Hulk whenever you see that animation taking place. And so I want them to constantly be thinking about that Red Hulk while I'm making other moves, right? So trying to throw them off their game plan. So that's where the top 3 powerful cards come into play. I mentioned turn 7, 30 plus power. So where does that plus come in? Let's take a look at our 1-cost cards because I'm going to start with Kitty Pryde. So Kitty Pryde, that's the perfect card to spam if you're playing a deck like this. Because by the end of your game, whether you were only able to get to turn 6 or if you got lucky and you could play Magic and you did get to turn 7, you can have this up to a power level 4 or 5. I've been lucky with how lands drop, and you get bonus power if cards are played on a specific land to get that even higher. So that's where the plus and 30 plus comes into play on turn 7. So that turns into possibly dropping 30 plus power across 3 lands instead of 2, depending on how your game is going. So Kitty Pryde, that's the first card to call out. If we take a step back and say, okay, what would the perfect game look like? How would that start off? For me, that would be getting all 3 of my 1-cost cards and, Red Hulk. Because, as you know from playing the game, as soon as you start the game, it's going to drop 3 cards in your hand, and then as turn 1 begins, each person will get a 4th card. So the reason why that's like the perfect like turn 1 for me is I'm going to put Nebula out first on turn 1 if I'm able to get my card layout how I want it. Because this is how you can also start messing with your opponent's head as well. Because you could put this on a land that maybe you don't particularly care about, at least for that time being anyway. Or even put it on a land that's undiscovered, like, your turn 1, so the second land and the third land, you don't even know what's going to be there, right? So you're adding that extra level of stress to them, saying, oh crap, they have Nebula, and as you can see, you're reading the ability, it's going to be +2 power if your opponent doesn't play a card there, so you're kind of controlling your lanes a little bit by introducing this as early as possible into the game. So that's why I play this turn 1 over Kitty Pryde, even though I just mentioned to spam Kitty Pryde as much as possible, just so that way you can start crafting the lay of the land, pun intended, to your benefit if the cards are forever in your favor, using a Hunger Games term. So that would be turn 1. Then turn 2, if I have Sunspot and Kitty Pryde, that's when I throw those out there. Sunspot is a card that I use a lot if you're unfamiliar with it. Get it as quickly as possible, so if it shows up in any of the storefronts, insanely good card. And this is even after getting a nerf, because it used to be a 1/1, now it's a 1/0. I don't care, it still works great for me for this deck and some of my other decks. And if you look at the boosters, that goes to show how often I play this, and that's on top of like doing tons of upgrades and variants and whatnot. So that goes to show that this is by far my favorite card. So after each turn, gain +1 power for each unspent energy. So kind of in a similar vein to Hulk. This one you do have to cast it though. So it has to be out there, like on the land, for that ability to kick in. So unlike Red Hulk, which can be in your hand. So that's one minor difference. Obviously, the casting cost and the power level starting point, very different between the two. But this one should make you feel better about skipping turn 6. So that's precisely why this card is in this deck. Is if I have unspent energy by normal means, because you're not always going to get things how you want it, and play to the max on each level, by maxing out all of your casting costs that you have. So this helps complement that. So if it's like turn 3 and only have like a 1 or 2 cost card and Sunspot's out there, it's going to eat up that extra unspent energy. So I love that. Can't stress that enough. And then that should make you feel better about skipping turn 6. Because turn 6 comes along if you have Magic out there, and you have your powerful cards ready to go for turn 7. This will gain, 6 power, just like that. Snap, pun intended. So that's really the method to my madness there. Cards that I swap out. I know I mentioned Red Hulk. That's one that I swap out. Rogue is another one. Just because the meta right now, once again, I'm filming this on the 15th of May. There's a lot of stuff going on with Ultron, so this won't counter Ultron directly. Rogue, that is. Just to make sure I point out what I'm talking about. But some of the cards that usually complement Ultron in an Ultron deck. So I won't go into that now, but remember Rogue for later. And then White Widow. I counteract White Widow and Black Widow from time to time, or I may throw something else in there, depending on what missions I have, or if there's like a specific featured land that makes more sense to have something else in place. That's one of my hot swappable cards. Luke Cage, I put that in there because for a while I was getting matched up against a lot of negative decks. So these are decks that their sole purpose in life is to make your cards go to 0 and sometimes beyond 0 if the cards play in their favor. So I like to keep that in there for that reason. And I think that's the major ones. Shang-Chi, that's another one that I swap out from time to time, but that's also another good one that can help you control what's going on with the lands, or maybe the cards didn't work in your favor towards the end of the game and you need to kill off some enemy power somewhere. So as you can see, if you're unfamiliar with it, destroy all enemy cards here, aka whatever land you play it on, that have 10 or more power. So this one did get a buff probably about a year ago. It feels like it's been a minute now. This one used to do 9 or above, but now it's 10 or more, or 10 or above, however you want to word that. But I still like it. A lot of people do too. That one can be dangerous though if you're going against a destroy deck, so just FYI. We'll talk a little bit more about destroy decks in a moment as well. But anyway, so favorite deck, She-Not deck. I hope that helped you know, the explanation behind it. I don't have my stats in front of me, but according to SnapFan, this is definitely the deck that I have played the most. It's evolved the most as well, because there is a number of swappable cards. So my main staple cards is going to be like all my 1-cost cards, and at least at the moment, all my 6-cost cards. Like I said, I will occasionally swap out Red Hulk, but that's usually for a very temporary basis. I will go back to him very quickly, unlike Rogue, unlike White Widow, which are just there because of how the meta is set up right now. Yeah, so I hope that helps. You know, think about like the logic or even the science, if you will, behind developing a deck. And once again, my favorite deck there. So moving on, I mentioned Ultron. Ultron's a funny story for me because I used to have an Ultron deck that I played very heavily for a long time. It's not that Ultron got bad, it's just, you know, things change in card games, and this goes for every card game. So that's not a unique thing to Marvel Snap by any means. New cards come out, you know, new decks are created, and even new archetypes in some situations become a thing. And so Ultron just kind of fell out of favor for me, and I think for a lot of people. Once again, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I know for a fact that the amount of uses for Ultron definitely went down. But a week ago, actually, it may be to the day, I can't remember if it was Tuesday or Wednesday last week. But anyway, Ultron got a buff, not for Ultron himself, but to its drones. So if I click into it, it's not going to show much there, but notice how it's a 1-2. So before a week ago, that was 1-1. So by default, I mean, if you look at Ultron's ability, if you're unfamiliar with Ultron, deploy 4 2-power drones to each other location. By default, you're like, okay, that's interesting, but that's not a lot of power, right? By default, it still isn't. I mean, it got better, obviously, because if you have a land that has gone untouched on your side, and you drop Ultron on a different land, because it's only going to do it to the lands that Ultron is not on, FYI. Just want to be clear about that. Yeah, you're only looking 2, 4, 6, 8, so 8 power by default. So not that fancy, but if we look at an Ultron-themed deck, there's definitely ways to make those drones more powerful, along with any other cards that don't have their own special abilities. So if we look at Brood, not Brood per se, but as you can see, it's going to add 2 Broodlings. And so these are 3/2, so another power level of 2 is going to be dropped. So this one is kind of similar to Ultron, but different in that you would want to play this on a land that has nothing there, or only 1 card to get the full effect of it. Because it's going to have the Brood card, but then 2 Broodlings will come out immediately. So that's going to give you a total of 6 between those 3, once again at the base power level. Let's look at some things that can modify that. So Patriot comes to mind immediately. So ongoing, your cards with no abilities have +2 power. This is why I said earlier when I was looking at my She-Hulk deck, or She-Not deck, excuse me, that, you know, Rogue was very important because a lot of people are playing Ultron decks, and this is one card why. Your power level goes through the roof for those cards with no abilities, thanks to this, especially if you combine this with, say, Mystique. Oh yeah, you're on to something there, right? Because if you can play Patriot turn 3, Mystique turn 4, and then, you know, have your Brood and Ultron maybe 5, 6, or either or, and you find something else that can even bubble up that power even more, like a Blue Marvel. Like, holy smokes. If the lands lay a certain way, as in, you know, I'm terrible at remembering the land name, so my apologies, but there's lands out there that will lower casting costs for certain cards. So one of my favorite, and I think a lot of people's favorite, is a land that will lower your casting cost by 1. So if you're fortunate enough to get that, you could even drop an Onslaught on a spot that has like a Blue Marvel, that has a Patriot. And so that would be 3 right there. That would be insanely awesome if you could get, you know, Patriot, follow up with Mystique, or, you know, Blue Marvel Mystique, just throwing that out there. So something Mystique can copy from either of those 2. Or even Dazzler. Dazzler is a fun one too, because that one is going to be +2 power for each location that's full on your side. So that and Mystique, also powerful. And then if you throw Onslaught into the mix, double your other ongoing effects here. insanely popular card. Not only for Ultron decks, but for like power decks. So I don't have the best power deck right now. I'll kind of talk about that in a moment, but we'll come back to that. But as you can see, like the perfect play for this deck would be to get Dazzler out pretty quick. Invisible Woman, I have it there mostly just to mess with my opponent. Kind of like what I was talking about, the psychological aspect of the game. So they're going to constantly be looking at that and wondering, what are you playing there? They may even drop a Cosmo there, so you could cause them to waste a Cosmo by doing that if you have ongoing cards that you're playing behind Invisible Woman, so that's pretty cool. So that's really the reasoning for that card, but yeah, so the perfect land drop. So if as we know, we only have four cards that can go on a land, would be to have Patriot, Mystique follow that up, Onslaught, and then Ultron on one land. And I don't even care if there's anything on any of the other lands, because Ultron's going to work as magic for those other two lands, right? The only thing that prevents Ultron from dropping on another land is if that land is locked down. So this is where Professor X becomes a nice complement, or an opponent. I wouldn't really call it complement, but an opponent, to an Ultron deck, because it's going to lock down that location. There's not much you can do with a Professor X, as you may already know. But Jeff comes to mind if you're unfamiliar with Jeff, which is a hilarious character name. You can move this once. Nothing can stop you from moving or playing this to any location. So that's kind of your counter to Professor X, because a lot of the times I'll see X played on an empty land by the opponent, just because they're trying to build up their power at the other lands, and like, oh, he hasn't played anything on this land, so let me drop X, and I'll win that with just a 1 power card. So Jeff can help battle against that too. So anyway, going back to this deck, there's also Claw. Claw works very well with Onslaught, so that's one of your backup mechanics that you can kind of piggyback off of. Another good one, we talked about Blue Marvel already, but Wave is in here to lower the power level of some of those high-end cards. So that's pretty cool. If you can get that on turn 3, that will allow you to do any of this bottom row. So you have 2 5 cost cards and then 2 6 cost cards. So that gives you a little wiggle room there to be able to drop one of those early on a turn 4. So very powerful. Ant-Man, kind of in a similar vein to Dazzler, just there because it's a backup card. You're trying to get a card in every single spot, so you want 12 cards played by the end of your game. So swappable cards, Invisible Woman. Sometimes I swap that out with Magic. I know we talked about Magic already, so that's a good one. I've tinkered with Hawkeye, just because that's a power raising card as well. This one you should get very early on, and maybe a Series 1 card, even if not Series 1, Series 2 for sure, I would imagine, because it was in the game almost day 1. Anyway, so those are my swappable cards for that, but that's Ultron. Moving on, so some other decks that I'm working with right now. Let's go to my Destroy deck, MDK all day, some Murder Death Kill. So the goal there is to destroy your cards, and there's a small spattering of destroying your opponent's cards as well. So that's where Killmonger comes into play, so that's the first card I'll highlight. Big fan of this card, even in non-destroy decks, mostly just to throw your opponent off of their game plan. If you notice they're playing a lot of 1-cost cards and you want to mess them over. Also, this is a good candidate for an anti-Ultron deck. So as time goes on, if more and more people are readapting to Ultron, like I did, because I fully deleted my Ultron deck at one point until the buff happened a week ago. So this is a good counter to Ultron deck. Just hope they don't have anything to protect the cards, those 1-cost cards, but it's there. X-23, that's considered a staple of pretty much all destroy decks. If you're unfamiliar with it, when this is discarded or destroyed, generated at a random location, and you get +1 energy next turn. So that helps you, build out your land drops a little bit quicker if you can destroy that as much as possible. Yondu goes after an opponent card. So this is a card that's given out pretty early on as well. Destroy the lowest cost card in your opponent's deck. So pretty nice. That one got a change because I think at one point, if I remember correctly, it didn't have any special verbiage. It just said it's going to destroy a card. And then it got a change. The first change that I remember off the top of my head anyway, it would say, oh, I'm just going to destroy whatever's at the top of your deck. So whatever they would be drawing next turn, it's going to kill that off for you. And then now, we have it as this. So destroy the lowest cost card in your opponent's deck. I like it because, if you're running a destroy deck, your ultimate goal is to get null out there. And as you can see, it has combined power of all cards destroyed. So it doesn't matter if it's your destroyed cards or if it's your opponent's destroyed cards. So very nice. Sometimes I don't even care about that, though, because I tried to do a combo of Venom. This is a very popular play, so just get as many cards out in a lane, leave a spot for Venom, let Venom destroy it, and then follow that up with this guy. Destroy one of your other cards here to copy it to the other locations. So that's the main mechanic that pretty much everybody's doing with their destroy decks right now, is get cards out there, let Venom destroy them on one of the lanes, then play this bad boy alongside Venom. And then you're essentially sacrificing a land if you're doing this turn 6. Because, you're going to have a 0-cost card on one of the lanes. So just keep that in mind. But if the cards play right, it doesn't matter. You'll be good to go. Another mechanic that's kind of cool with this is getting Jane Foster out there in combination with Ravona. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. But yeah, your cards with 1 or less power cost 1 less. So if you can get this out early in the game, and then drop Jane Foster, that will help. Get cards in your hand quicker. Mr. Negative is a good aspect of that too. So swap the power cost of all your cards in your deck. So what this does, yes, you're dropping a -1 card on the field, but you're making up for it immediately if you don't have these 2 cards in your hand, because these immediately become a 0-cost card to play, which is insanely awesome. So you could, in theory, play this turn 4. If you're already using Venom, Venom's out there wrecking it, everything, along with Carnage. That's another one, if you're unfamiliar with. Destroy other cards here, plus 2 power for each destroyed. So its main claim to fame is to build up a power level, let Venom eat them, but ultimately to build out Null as well. So, yeah, so there's so many different ways of doing this. Obviously, Iron Man, that's kind of a backup card. That's definitely one of my hot swappable cards. So speaking off of that element, maybe you want to get a lower cost card in the game quicker. You could take Iron Man out, maybe throw a Nova in there. So if you're unfamiliar with Nova, when this is destroyed, give your cards +1 power. Or maybe an Angel, because Angel comes into play when one of your cards is destroyed. This flies out of your hand or deck to replace it. So that's a quick and easy way to get an additional card out there. So very popular. And there's other stuff too. That's just 2 that comes to mind. Not really related to destroy decks, but just messing with your opponent. Sometimes I'll toss Spider-Ham in there for fun. To see if I can, tackle one of their cards in their hand. If you're unfamiliar with that, transform the leftmost card in your opponent's hand into a pig. And this is what a pig looks like. So it's going to keep the power level. It's going to keep the casting cost of whatever that card was before it turned into a pig. But any abilities, it's going to remove the text. So any ongoing, on reveal abilities will go away immediately. So that's another one of those cards that I'll swap in from time to time. But yeah, I won't get too much into destroy decks. There's tons of videos that talk about that. Just like glossing over my current one at the moment. Deck 20. I don't even have a name for that one. What did I do this? Oh, this is where I was messing around with a different type of destroy deck. So Blink came out recently. So swap the last card you played with a higher cost card from your deck. So I talked about that in episode 1. And so that's really just that deck again, so I won't really go in depth with that. I just forgot to name it, so I forgot to even add this. I built it, and I used it for a week straight when Blink first came out, and honestly, I haven't touched it since. So, and I'll keep it for now, because I think this is a good deck to play around with. It might actually become my default destroy deck with a couple changes, so more to come on that. Actually, I will go back to it for a moment. Another staple of a good destroy deck is Death. If you're unfamiliar with what Death does, costs 1 less for each card destroyed this game. Doesn't matter if it's your card that got destroyed or your opponent's card that got destroyed. So, very cool aspect there. I like that a lot. So that's it for the story. I'm not going to touch that too much right now. On the topic more. Long video. Let me highlight one more. Red Death. I'll do that one. This is an alternate to my She-Not deck. So when Red Hulk first came out, I built a Red Hulk deck, and then eventually we got Blink. So I included that into it as well. So I have been playing this one kind of heavily. She-Hulk is in there just because, one of the goals is trying to get to turn 7 again, because there's magic again, just like the first deck we covered. So in theory, turn 7 comes into play. You can cast Red Hulk and She-Hulk on turn 7, maybe with Kitty Pryde or another one of these one-cost cards. Martyr makes an appearance here, mostly just because I'm trying to figure out if I like Martyr or not. They haven't done any changes since this came out. It's been out for a little bit now. At the end of the game, move to a location that loses you the game, if possible. So it is possible that this may not move at all. So it's a one-cost card that has 5 power, so I'm willing to tinker with that and see if I like it or not. This one also has Baron Zemo, which is good for stealing a card from your opponent as well. So I really like that one. So that's probably the major changes between my She-Not deck and this deck is Blink, Baron Zemo, and Martyr at the moment. Everything else, I wouldn't say everything, but most of everything else is the same. I threw Viper in there, which I might go ahead and swap out, but once again, I was facing a lot of negative card decks, but that's now becoming more Ultron-ish. So trying to, send a Hobgoblin or a Green Goblin back over to my opponent is really the goal of Viper. Or if I just have like a lower cost card that I'm not really getting a lot of value out of, like one of these one cost cards, and I want to get rid of it, I can do so just to clog the lane. So anyway, this has been an extremely long episode. I'm going to pause here, so I will do another episode like this. But yeah, so that will cover it for today's episode. Thank you for watching. If you lasted this long, thank you for that as well. Let me know if you like these longer episodes, because I have no problem digging deep into the weeds of not only decks that I'm playing, but what the meta is currently operating off of as well. So, but that's all for today. Thank you for your time, and happy snapping.